So, philosophy and theology. Philosophy seeks, theology responds. Now, some of you are going to say, well, I'm listening to this lecture here at the Institute of Lutheran Theology, and this guy is saying this, and you might be watching this on Ustream or on YouTube, and you might be saying, well, this is not how I heard it. Well, of course, I'm a philosopher and a theologian, so I'm giving you my constructive best answers to this question of how philosophy and theology relate. And I'm taking theology in a little narrower sense than some might. Man I used to teach with over at the university next door wanted to talk about theology as basically dealing with any of those questions that have ultimate meaning. But I think that the difference between theology and philosophy is best understood not so much in their content, but how we approach that content. Philosophy is an autonomous grasp of the answer on the basis of the question, and theology is a theonomous response to the answer, theonomous response to the answer, and then going back to try to interpret the question in light of the answer. So, philosophy starts with the question, tries to solve the answer. Theology, in some sense, starts with the answer and tries to unpack the question. Both, however, are disciplines. Greek philosophy developed a structured activity of seeking reasons why things are as they are. And this activity constitutes a discipline, and theology is a discipline. When you get into disciplines, you get into theory. And theory differs from practice. Now, the best example of this goes back a few years, not that far, but back to maybe 4,000 years ago, when the Egyptians were surveying. They would do all kinds of surveys because, of course, the Nile had to go in certain ways and irrigated land. They were surveying land. They developed ways, rules of thumb by which to understand how big this bit of land was over against this bit of land over here. And they could start to calculate these things. But it took Greek disciplined thinking to turn these early surveying rules of thumb into a discipline of geometry, right? Geometry. And there were a lot of Greek mathematicians that work on this, but much of what they did became part of the great book by Euclid, a book that is not studied nearly as much as it should be studied these days. But Euclid, of course, collected many of the proofs, the geometrical proofs, and he had some of his own. We don't know which ones he had or didn't have exactly, or I don't know that. Maybe some people know that, but I don't know that, and I know that some people don't know that because I've read books that say they don't know that. But at any rate, yeah, it's not my field. Euclid was, of course, very interested in giving us a strict demonstration, rational demonstration of geometrical truths, right? And what developed here was the so-called axiomatic method, where you started with a certain set of axioms, definitions, and rules by which we were able to derive new theorems from axioms and earlier theorems. And this whole way of going about things is a way of logical deduction. And so 50 years ago, 80 years ago, when students in high school studied Euclid, they studied a paradigmatic example of logical derivation. They might not have known it, but that's what they were studying. And that was, I would say, good for them. Well, now we don't study Euclid as much, and so a lot of mathematics comes, I believe, well, here's how you apply this formula to this problem. And so the kids don't understand where the formula came from. They just know, oh, I'm supposed to apply it over here. Actually, good mathematical instruction shows you where the formula came from. And the more theoretical mathematics is, the less interested it is in solving particular engineering problems, but much more interested in showing how theorems are derived from earlier theorems and axioms. Western philosophy was born in Greece with this kind of theoretical approach that we see in geometry and in Greek mathematicians. And of course, philosophy took on this approach. The method of logical derivation became very important. Plato talked about a dialectical method. We can't get into all the specifics here. But of course, all of this had to do with finding through human reason answers to certain questions. Okay? And so philosophy was that dispute. It was a discipline, a theoretical discipline that gave answers to questions through the use of reason. And when theology arose as a systematic reflection upon the Christ event of the first century, when that arose, it made use of the same kinds of patterns of reasoning. People knew that theology had to be able to, shall we say, justify the assertion of particular propositions. They had to be able to justify that assertion on the basis of other propositions. And so theology became theoretical. Now, we live in a time where it seems like the average person doesn't like theory, and indeed, oftentimes the theoretical person is lampooned as being a guy out of touch with reality. And of course, those poor guys on The Big Bang, remember that movie? I saw that TV show on the airplane, so I can talk about it, a bit of pop culture. Of course, these physics guys, and they're nerds and everything. But probably the biggest nerd was Thales himself, right? Thales back there in the 6th century, because he, looking at the sky, thinking deep thoughts, fell into a well. And the maid came by, and she pointed out to him that he was foolish and laughed at him. Geeky philosophers always get laughed at by pop culture, yes, right? Okay, that was a bit of humor interjected gratuitously. Now, the major questions for Greek thought we should probably look at, because they relate to, of course, theological questions. How is it possible for different things to be ultimately one thing? If you're looking at this slide, you're seeing two guys. Well, one's Plato and one's Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's student. They were both at Athens. Then Aristotle went and studied, or started his own school called the Lyceum. The school of Athens was the academy, and Plato and Aristotle were there. And that's a very famous, Raphael, very famous painting. So, Plato and Aristotle and others were interested in how is it possible for different things to be ultimately one thing? That's the question of the one and the many. How is it possible for something to be what it is and still change? How does that little tree become a big tree and still be the same tree? This is called the problem of change. And how is it possible to say that something is not without first somehow saying that it is? This is the question of so-called negative existential judgments. How can you claim that something is not the case without, in some sense, claiming that that thing is? I could have some long, perhaps, examples of this, but it would make this lecture even more tedious than it might be. Okay, I want to go to the next issue. Theology and philosophy both concern ontology. Ontology is logos. We talked about this before. Logos, which means discourse about, or ruled discourse about, disciplined discourse about. Ontos, right? Ruled discourse about being. So ontology is the discipline having to do with being. Now sometimes we hear the word metaphysics. And if you're not an old, 60s guy or early 70s guy, where metaphysics became something that had to do with crystals and all kinds of weird stuff, the New Age movement. Classically, metaphysics is talked about because there was a book that Aristotle had in his Organon that was the book after the physics. The book on the physics dealt with what we might call scientific philosophy, if you will. But there was a book after that that was more abstract, that just dealt with being itself, and that was the book after the physics. So the word for after is meta, beyond. So the book after the physics is called the metaphysics. But the phrase metaphysics is a double entendre, so not only is it a book after the other book, but it's also the book beyond the physics, in that it deals with that area that goes beyond merely the physical. So it deals with that area of being, and sometimes it's called the study of being qua being. Now, when you ever see the word qua used in that way, that's of course Latin, being qua being, which means being insofar as being is being. Okay? Being as it is being. Being insofar as being is being. That's what it means. So metaphysics deals with being insofar as being is being. And ontology is concerned with being as well. And sometimes the two are used interchangeably, these two terms, metaphysics and ontology. Ontology deals with the sum total of beings and what it is to be. And now we're going to have a little lesson in Latin, which could also be a lesson in Greek, which could also be a lesson in German, which could also be a lesson in French, but unfortunately is not a lesson in English. Because these other languages distinguish nicely in their languages between being and being, but we don't. So, for instance, in Latin, the word ens means a being. That is, a thing that is. But the word esse means the to-be-ness. So, this is to-be-ness. So, you could talk about beings, right? Or you could talk about the to-be-ness of beings. In German, we have a distinction between Seiendes and Sein. Seiendes is a being, and Sein, or Seiende, and Sein is to be. So the name of Heidegger's great book, Sein und Zeit, right? Sein und Zeit, 1527. The book came out, Sein und Zeit by Martin Heidegger. It's a great year for the New York Yankees, by the way. Wonderful year. I think Ruth had 60 homers that year. Sein und Zeit means to be and time. Being and time. So the way I like to talk about it means we only have one word here in English. That's the word being. I like to discriminate accordingly. I like to talk about the distinction between being, which is a being, and being, which is the to-be-ness of beings. So there's a distinction between being, and of course no one hyphens being this way, but I'm going to do it so you understand we're talking about the to-be-ness of beings.